everyone. Welcome. We're so happy that you are here today. We'll give you a moment to get situated as we welcome you. We are so happy to have you here for our Q2 follow-up for the BIPOC Support Foundation Book Club. Today, we're going to be discussing our assigned text, Grading for Equity. So we hope you've had the opportunity to read it, and if not, we're really looking forward to discussing it with you anyway.
There we go. In advance of our discussion, we'd like to invite you all to join in a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is not a new practice, but it is one you may be unfamiliar with. A land acknowledgement is a formal protocol honoring the land and the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land for thousands of years. As we begin our book club event, it is important to note that this event today, while virtual, is being hosted in a region within the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay, Diegueño, and Luiseno people. Land acknowledgements remind us that colonialism and settler colonialism is an ongoing process, and our continued work is to be mindful about how we participate and contribute to the oppression. It's our intention to enter into this work in a good way. We acknowledge the land in which we live, reside, and work as the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay, Luiseno, and Diegueño people. We pay respect to the Kumeyaay and Luiseno and Diegueño nations, both past and present, with their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands and waterways. And we recommit ourselves to the important work of dismantling systems of oppression within our region. These acknowledgements commit us to a lifetime of anti-racist work. We'd like to start off today with some quick introductions. A passionate educator and advocate, Camila Brown has served families throughout Los Angeles and San Diego counties. An avid storyteller, she's worked with teachers and students in both general and special education in grades K through 12. She works with nonprofit organizations that focus on literacy, youth empowerment, STEAM, equity, and social justice. Camila believes access to high quality education to be a basic human right and currently works in the greater San Diego region as a school administrator. Camila enjoys all things language, culture, and travel.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing Joanne Fox. She has been a teacher in the Escondido Union School District since 2000. She spent over a decade teaching in the primary grades and the last several years working with upper elementary and middle school students. She is currently working as an instructional coach, supporting distance learning and blending learning. Joanne is a Google certified innovator, the 2012 San Diego County Teacher of the Year, 2012 semifinalist for California Teacher of the Year, a CUE lead learner, CUE bold presenter, and CUE rockstar faculty. In addition, Joanne served on the California Education Technology Task Force with former State Superintendent Tom Torlakson. Joanne is a co-founder and moderator of California EdChat, which is a popular Twitter chat where teachers from all over California collaborate and discuss educational issues. Joanne blogs about the intersection of pedagogy and app integration on her website, appeducation.com.
Joanne, you're muted.
Hi, I'm back. I get to introduce Cassiopeia, a leading edge and National Geographic certified educator. Cassiopeia is credentialed in K-12 education, multiple subjects, single subjects, English and social science, with specializations in biliteracy and middle level education, storytelling through digital media, and blended and online instruction. She currently works as a district ed tech TOSA in the Escondido Union High School District. She's also on the advisory council here at BIPOC Support Foundation. Cassiopeia is passionate about equity work in the education and art spaces and believes that culturally and historically responsive curriculum, restorative justice, and competency and project-based learning are important tools in our educator toolboxes.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Last but not least, we have Jennifer Medeiros. Jennifer is an education leader, activist, and ally who has spent the last 20+ years partnering with tribal governments, community leaders, and governmental and nonprofit institutions to create learning spaces and opportunities that reflect the strengths and values of the communities and student populations they are meant to serve. Jennifer currently focuses that energy in her capacity as the Language and Literacy Content Specialist for the Escondido Union High School District, where she is working to create more equitable literacy and language development programs for all learners and greater systems of support to ensure success for emerging multilingual learners. Jennifer brings expertise in leveraging culturally relevant teaching practices to build capacity and retain high-quality teachers. She is a Rise Up Fellow and holds her doctorate in educational leadership from the University of California, San Diego.
We're really honored to have this opportunity to be tackling such an ambitious set of goals today. And so that you have an idea of what to expect, we built an agenda for you so that you can understand how our time will be spent together. We'll begin by reviewing our outcomes and our norms. We will review who the author is and a little bit about the book. We will have some time to discuss the text with each other, and we will debrief our discussion and have some reflections and questions at the end, and plus some resources on where to go next to continue your journey with this book.
So our goals, as experienced educators, when we dive into any work or any tasks or activities with students, we always have an end result. We always are end result focused and have a goal in mind. Where are we trying to go? And so what's our destination? And with that, today we're looking to reinforce why equity conversations are important and model what authentic, vulnerable conversations about equity can look like in the classroom and amongst your colleagues. Next, we're looking to discuss critical changes in our current grading beliefs and practices, and analyze to what extent our practices uphold those beliefs. Next, discuss how to be a part of changing the system to be more equitable for students, and walking away with at least one actionable change that we can implement immediately. So we're looking to equip you with tools to be implemented immediately. I'm also covering the norms. So with any hearty and diving deep into a conversation, anything of substance, we all, in order to have a productive conversation, we wanted to acknowledge that many of us bring our own experience and histories of racism, with racism and oppression. And while we may experience validation, we understand that material and conversations presented here or in other spaces may spark some sense of trauma or frustration or guilt, or a sense of uncomfortableness. And so with that in mind, we've come up with a list of norms that we just want to use as a frame to kind of help us in pushing this conversation forward. So they are, if you could please listen and speak with respect. Both nonverbal and nonverbal language is powerful. I'm a minder of faces, as that's my thing I've worked on tremendously, so I can certainly understand that. Respecting others' privacy and only telling your own story. Share the time fairly, land the plane, which basically means, we want to honor and hear everything that everyone has to say, but get to we want to get to the deeper heart of it, to get to the meat of it. Listen to understand rather than to respond. Expect to be misunderstood. Practice forgiveness and lean into the discomfort. And just by committing to these norms, and maybe you want to land on one or two, we believe that our conversation will be productive and both daring and push about change. Thank you.
As we dive into this book study today, we want to connect this to our prior knowledge, our background experiences, vocabulary, and the context of our last meeting. So you'll recall at our last session, we previewed this work, but I wanted to also share this brief excerpt from a recent BuzzFeed article shared by a colleague of mine over on Twitter that directly related to this conversation. Let's read it together. I became a teacher after I had 2 children of my own. I had to do a 20-hour practicum in a 6th grade class, working on reading and comprehension with a particularly tough set of kids. I gave them an assignment that I was going to check on the next day. Out of 7 kids, 2 of them had their assignments. Naturally, I took on my teacher face and asked them why they didn't do their work. There were excuses like I didn't have paper at home, I had too much work to do in the house, and I didn't know how. So I responded, "Why didn't you ask your parents for help? I'm sure they would have helped if you'd asked. And you can always take paper from another notebook." Only one kid spoke up, and his answer will never leave my memory as long as I live. He said, "You have to be one of those cookie baking PTA mothers who cook dinner every night and do laundry and shit like that, huh?" I told him that yes, I'd baked my share of cookies and tried to fix supper at night when I wasn't just too tired. He then told me that his mother wasn't ever home. He didn't know where his dad was, and he took care of his brothers and sisters. The others in the group then talked about the various but very similar conditions they each lived in. I knew these conditions existed, sure, but in my own little town, in my kids' school, I had a whole new outlook from then on. I didn't graduate for 2 more years, but I knew then to look for and appreciate the different circumstances kids come from. I never again assumed anything about kids, and that was a really, really good thing to learn. My pointy black hat for BuzzFeed. As you can see, Pointy Black Hat had a similar experience to one that many of us have had. So the question is, once you have this realization and you look at the data that Joe Feldman presents and you come to that precipice of understanding, what do you do with it? That's what we're going to talk about today. Learnings, understandings, and next steps. Today, we're going to collaboratively dive into this text and participate in a variety of instructional techniques to engage in the active use of grading for equity. We are hopeful that you will take some actionable steps with you, as she said, when you leave today, that you can implement in your own classroom for this fall term.
Previously, in our last session, we learned a little bit about Joe Feldman in the book. So I'm going to give a quick summary of both him and the book. Joe Feldman has worked in education at the local and national levels for over 20 years, both in charter and district school context, as a teacher, principal, and district administrator. He currently is the CEO of Crescendo Education Group, a consulting organization that partners with schools and districts to help teachers use improved and more equitable grading and assessment practices. He is the author of several articles on grading and assessment and the author of Teaching Without Bells, What We Can Learn from Powerful Practices in Small Schools. The book we're focusing on today is Grading for Equity, what it is, why it matters, and how it can transform schools and classrooms. This book was published in 2019 by Corwin Publishing Company. In this book, Feldman introduced us to the historical context of grading practices. He analyzed the practice of grading with the use of years of research and introduced us to specific grading practices aligned to 3 critical pillars for equitable grading practices: mathematical accuracy, bias resistance, and motivational. As he wrote, grading practices are a mirror, not just for our students, but for us as their teachers. Each one of us should start by asking, what do my grading practices say about who I am and what I believe?
All right, now let's chat. So we have a free writing activity, and we're going to start off using a tool called Padlet. If you're already familiar with Padlet, just go ahead and dive into it. I believe one of my colleagues is going to put the link in the chat. And if you're not as familiar with Padlet, that's okay. It is a digital pen or community board. So think of it as if you're out in the laundromat or a coffee shop and you have like the bulletin board where you see all the advertisement posts and notes and whatnot, that's Padlet. In a classroom, a teacher can create a wall where students in the class will interact with one another, exchanging text and images and links and videos and documents in response to a prompt that's provided to them. It can be public. You can change the settings to be public, private, or secretly shared within a small group of students. And you can also set it up as an interaction tool. For example, on this Padlet, I've added a method so that you can post your comment in the other mediums and then respond and interact with the other participants. You can comment through comments and likes, okay? So we're gonna take about 2 minutes to respond. You can use words, pictures, video if you are savvy. I will just be doing text and looking at the following questions, and the questions are listed on the Padlet as well. It's how did the book make you feel? And if you are just opening the book, what about this book, what drew you to the book or what's drawing you to the book to want to read it? And what questions do you have about the implementation of these practices? So if you can go ahead and meet us over, click the link and meet us over there on the Padlet. I'll see you soon. I'm gonna set our timer. All right. You want to go ahead and share or?
You want me to share the Padlet?
Yeah, click it and take us over there. Okay. So 2 minutes, and let's start answering the questions and type in and respond. Feel free to respond and with whatever resonates with you. I love this. How did this book make you feel? Someone put validation and urgency. The points that the author made validated shifts I made in my classroom over the years. I was also struck by the urgency of this work and the need for system-wide change. I agree. What question? All right, I think that's about 2 minutes. And so now our 2 minutes is up. Feel free to type in if you still have some comments. And let's take some time to read through these, okay? Any noticings that you'd like to share with the group? I shared one earlier. Anything stand out to anyone that they would like to share?
I'd love to share one of the comments that I'm reading that says, I had many feelings of guilt as I read this book because that really resonates with me. I also got back on my own practice in the classroom when I was first beginning, and I really realized how many of the decisions that we make in a classroom um, are are really rooted in our own experiences of how we experienced the classroom when we were students as well. And that does not make that does not necessarily mean that that is the right way to do it. In fact, in many cases, we know that it is actively causing harm. And so that was really something that I felt I had to contend with at first, was this idea of being able to move forward, to be able to grow my own practice, being able to validate the practices that we were doing well in, and also acknowledging that this is an opportunity for us to fail forward together. So that really resonated with me, that feeling of guilt. I also experienced that.
And I like to address the question someone had about, is this something that can be done equitably as individual teachers, or does it has to be system wide? And like, that's a great question. And I think it has to start somewhere. And I think all of us reading this book, we're to start somewhere, people. And somebody has to do it. And when we start beginning these practices, we start adding to those conversations on our sites and at our district level. And it's something that, with a goal of systemic change, that we should all have. I know in my district, as we head into next year, every middle school teacher will be required to attend a session about grading for equity at our back to school conference. So I'm really excited about that. That's pretty getting systemic, right? So it will happen.
But we certainly recognize the challenge in that. The book talks about, the benefit to students in building trust and creating this space for them to take risks and to be vulnerable in learning basic to deep to complex.
You bring up a good point, because we have to, we know we can make those changes on our end, but it's going to be a big change on the student end. I remember when we started Quantum, we were like, we're going to be innovative and the kids are going to be empowered. Well, the kids weren't sure what to do with empowerment because they've had so many years of disempowerment. So we have to be sensitive to that too, that this will be a shift in student mindset.
I was reading an interview with Zaretta Hammond the other day, and she talked about the pedagogy of compliance, right? And that really ties into what we're talking about. This idea that we're doing what's best for kids by teaching them how to, X, Y, and Z, which when you dig into it, are really just compliance issues, and not the higher level critical thinking, self-awareness, self-reliance that we want from students. I noticed a theme in the statements and the questions about conversations, right? These tough conversations. We're really going to have to be digging in. And I think that ties back to the ouch that you were talking about, Cassiopeia, because in order to do this work, we really have to acknowledge that we've made mistakes that have probably harmed kids in the past. And as people who dedicate our lives to the service of young people, it's really hard to do that self-reflective kind of work. And so I think that acknowledging and being aware of that may help us with the empathy in some of these conversations that we need to have with our colleagues.
And piggybacking on that, Jennifer, I think the beauty of this and reading through the book is, this idea of how do we start the conversation. Some people may not be comfortable with just jumping in and starting to do the work without the why and the background information. And I think when you get to the earlier chapters of this book, going back to, let's talk about the purpose of education and the history of it and kind of walk a timeline, if you will, to today, and revisiting that idea of the why. I struck me, and this gave me a big question mark in my head. What struck me on page 33 was talking about most time in the lower grades, lower elementary, the first few years, what it is for the first few years of school, students are taught that success at learning is its own reward. So you have kiddos having fun. And then it says there's this shift in the second half of elementary when you start points and groupings and table points and teams and categorizing. And then that it just gets bigger and bigger. And my question, or a question to consider as you, a question for you to consider as you're looking at the background and history is, why the shift? Or why that shift? You know, it's like we start off on a good note and then it's kind of, and could it be that, like most of us share, we just doing what we knew to do, right?
Jen, you talked about your concern with statements like teachers can utilize their own professional expertise and how that ties into concerns around implicit bias. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
My district, San Diego Unified, did a lot of training this year on standards-based grading, and I really liked it. I didn't like the training. I liked the stuff. Let's put it that way. It was 12 hours that could have been 4, but the idea I really liked, and I did a pilot of it for myself in Q4 and created a standards-based grade book for myself in a spreadsheet and tried to manipulate all the different ways you could use Canvas and PowerSchool and how am I going to communicate to kids how they're doing, but still only have their actual grade based on their summative assessments and, you know, retakes and all those things. And, you know, a lot of what they talk about in the training is, well, when you have a student who's scoring a 3 on this and a 3 on this and a 4 on that and a 2 on that, how do you decide as a teacher what their overall grade is? And the answer is always, well, that's up to your professional judgment. But a lot of what we get told in grading is that your professional judgment is subject to implicit bias. So, I mean, it gets used as an, implicit bias is a reason we shouldn't use the 100-point scale, but it also is something that we're somehow ignoring as a factor when it comes to standards-based grading. And I don't think implicit bias goes away at all between standards-based grading and 100-point scale. I don't think there is a grading system that makes implicit bias go away. My colleagues who are subject to that, and I'm subject to that certainly, but I think that a teacher still looks at a kid's work and applies some level of implicit bias to that, whether they're assigning a standards-based score or a 100-point score. And it might be, in a standards-based score, when there's fewer, it's a smaller rubric, it's 4 points instead of 100. You're right, you're not going to have, if the kid's a 3, they're a 3, and it's not going to be such a big deal. But I think when it comes to looking at that kid across their work, there are absolutely students that I had last quarter that I know I gave the benefit of the doubt to more often than others. I recognize it in myself in a way where I was giving kids some extra boost that maybe they hadn't quite earned yet, but I knew they were capable of it, and I don't know that it worked in the opposite direction. I don't know that I was punishing kids, but I probably was. I don't think that goes away. That's my point.
Is that he talks about that, right? Like he talks about that in the initial portion of the book. He talks a lot about this idea of how teachers are basically fudging grades, fudging the numbers in order to try to make things to be more fair, what they would perceive as more fair, and in actuality that ends up being mathematically inaccurate. And so I know I felt really empowered, in particular by the the grade book on page 158. When I saw it, I thought to myself, gosh, I wish I'd had this a couple of years ago, because something that I really had to wrestle with is kind of this, as soon as I became more aware of standards-based grading, it was an immediacy for me that I knew that I needed to jump in right away. I needed to be involved in this. I made a decision same day. And actually, Dr. Jennifer Medeiros and I were teaching in the same department at the time. And she and I were like on the phone with each other, setting up our grade books right then and there. But we also knew that our grade books weren't really set up to do this. And we felt that we had to kind of manipulate them in order to make them work for a standards-based gradebook. And then we were also, the second piece of that is we were also having to contend with the challenge of what I experienced, which was knowing that if I was really looking at my students and really giving them what I felt was an accurate assessment of where they were in terms of the standards, then it could actually lead to my students being at a disadvantage. Some of my students at a disadvantage when it came to being compared to their peers who were being rewarded with a compliance gradebook type of situation.
Mhm.
As a 12th grade teacher, that was really difficult for me, knowing that my students were preparing for college and they were competing against students who had learned how to play the game
Mhm.
for those spots in colleges, and that my choices to try to make my gradebook more equitable for my students would also potentially disadvantage my students because it wasn't a system-wide change. And so I love your comments here because I really feel like you're 100% right. You're talking about teachers utilizing their own professional expertise, but also we're asking teachers to make a judgment on what is best for the students in front of them and what it is that students need. And that in and of itself is going to be impacted by their implicit biases. And I think that that's why, to circle back on the conversation I think somebody was asking in one of these questions, the change making question. That's why I think that this has to be a system-wide change, right? We can make changes at the micro level, but until we're making systemic change, students will continue to be inequitably disadvantaged by the systems that are perpetuated in our educational classroom spaces, right? Our districts, our society across the board.
And inequitably advantaged.
Exactly.
When I started to implement standards-based grading, I certainly found kids who were used to getting straight A's who were suddenly in the B and C range because they were proficient, but they weren't excelling. And they were like, well, how do I get an A? You have to be a genius to get an A. And I'm like, no, but you do have to show that you can meet this higher level standard.
Right. It's the Isabel and the Tangela, right? The book, Isabel and Tangela is what we're talking about here. And that I felt like that specific example early on in the text was so impactful for me because I thought, oh, wow, I know these students. I don't know these students, but I know these students. We have had these students in our rooms.
No, they were mad. Some of them really didn't like standards-based grading.
And then to your point, Jennifer, one of the things that I was on the same team with Cassiopeia and Dr. Medeiros, and I had the special ed lens, and many of the students struggled with standards-based grading in that it was literally an area they were evaluated in an area that wasn't strength, maybe an assessment or a summative kind of project. And it was a struggle to kind of keep them above water. So we were looking at how might it be more equitable or accessible for students that are learning disabled. And this idea, I love that you said, you, in this one example, you said you gave the student a benefit of the doubt. This idea of, is bias always negative? Because this idea of benefit of the doubt is a positive form of bias where you're considering the whole student, their work, the environmental factors, the other things that the student has that they come with into the classroom. One student may have and others may not. So I don't think, and that's just a new way of maybe a different lens to look at it. So I agree, there is bias in these practices, whether it's the 100-point system or standard-based grading, but then you kind of shift to what lens do we look at through this bias and how is this bias benefiting students and equitable?
Right. And not to mention that when you're talking about equity, really, if we are only implementing this in pockets, then students are having to unlearn and relearn these systems in every single classroom that they go to, right? And that's challenging for anyone, but it's especially challenging for our students with learning differences, for our students who are still trying to figure out how to navigate the school system in a language that is different from their, most comfortable language. Like there are so many different things that students are having to do, that we could, it's really on us to quote Cassiopeia in regards to online learning planning, to reduce the cognitive load that students need so that they can bring their full selves to this learning and to understanding and being a stakeholder in their grading, right? And in their learning growth. So I'd like to shift us now to a little bit more focused text discussion. We've been talking about kind of the ways that this resonated with us, but I want to share this passage from the text with all of you, and then come back to some of these questions. So in chapter 1 on page 13, it says, "We have been unwitting victims of this system as students and unwitting promoters of this system as teachers and even as caregivers. For many of us, the system works just fine, or at least we believed that it did. But in fact, the traditional system of evaluating students and reporting information about them has been part of the inequities, unfairness, and injustices built into our schools. When this book challenges you, try to put aside your devil's advocate stance, why these practices can't possibly work, and try an angel's advocate stance. Envision the possibilities and potential for teachers and students if we were to grade differently, more fairly, accurately, and equitably." So here are those questions that we're going to be discussing for the next 7 to 10 minutes. What does it mean to be an unwitting victim or an unwitting promoter? How does the complicit nature of our involvement in this system, your involvement individually, make you feel? What are some next steps that can be taken immediately, not only to revise our practices, but to be change leaders on our campuses? I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to think, and then you can respond, either mute yourselves or respond in the chat.
I'm going to chime in just to say that if you're somebody who feels less comfortable speaking, especially since we're recording this session, if you feel more comfortable typing it, I've actually added these questions to the Padlet. So if you would prefer to go and type in answers to the Padlet, we are happy to have you do that as well. You are more than welcome to respond that way. Or if you would like to unmute, or if you'd like to turn on your camera and dive right in, you're also welcome to that. Welcome to do that. We are more than excited to include you in whatever capacity you feel comfortable. I think I kind of tackled already that question number 2, how my nature and this involvement of the system really makes me personally feel. But I think that these words really resonated with me, the unwitting victim and unwitting promoter, because I feel like as teachers, many of us had our heart, well, we all had our hearts in the right place. We were all ready to dive in to make a difference for students in the best way possible. And when we did that, we did it really, really believing that all of these wonderful ideas that have been given to us in all of our credentialing programs and our degree programs were really going to help us go out and make a difference. And we approached our experiences with our students in whatever method we had sort of been taught, but where the system failed us was in this discussion, this communication about grading. This isn't a conversation that was had, not to this type of extent. And so what that meant was, when we were all first year teachers, it is very likely that many of you were in the same situation that I was in, which was, yeah, what's your grading policy? Cool, I'm going with that. And I was pulling in all of these numbers from the teacher next door, the department chair down the hall, in order to craft my own direction. We also know that some teachers really feel restricted by systemic expectations of what their grading policies are going to look like. I know that there are some schools, for example, where if you turn something in late, there is an immediate docking of that score, right? You can only get up to a certain percentage. And so sometimes the system is also contributing to this. So that makes me want to really lean into this last question. What are some next steps that we can take to be change leaders? Because that's where I see our opportunity, right? We have a chance to be able to spread the news, to talk about this, to engage in sometimes difficult and uncomfortable discussions with our colleagues about how this is working and how it's not. I love this comment that I see on the Padlet right now about being an unwitting victim or promoter. It says, it sucks, but it's also humbling. I'm ready to grow and learn now having read the book. I love that. And I remember actually seeing a comment in column 1, which was the column about how it made you feel, that I really loved because I think it kind of tied into this a little bit. It said, the one part that challenged me was regarding cheating. I completely understand a more restorative approach on cheating and understanding that behavior shouldn't be in the grade. I need more tools in this area. And I really feel like that is sort of, it's related to question 3, right? We need to equip colleagues with tools to be able to dive in affecting change and give them opportunities or ideas that can help them to modify their practice. And again, this idea of cheating and it being a behavioral assessment as opposed to being an accurate assessment of what their actual ability is with regards to the standard, I think is very, very closely tied to these systemic practices that we're seeing that are just they're happening and are just being passed from one teacher to the other.
I think the unwitting victim and the unwitting promoter, the part that really strikes me is that the grade books have become a housing space of assignments to be turned in rather than what they're supposed to be, which is a way to communicate academic progress and where a student is. And so when we talk about next steps, that leads to a lot of you saying that standards-based report card, where really the only thing in your report card, or not your report card, sorry, your standards-based grade book, the only part in your grade book that's actually adding to the summative grade are your evaluation of where they are as far as meeting each standard, while at the same time keeping record of all of those assignments being done and where a student has achieved according to the standards on those assignments, but keeping those not valued as that final into the final grade for your grade book, so that the students, because the other piece of the grade is to communicate to a student where they're at. So we do need to still kind of keep track of those assignments so students understand and they can look at that and go, oh, I can see I struggled on this, this, and this, and that's why my grade is this, because it's not showing that I'm meeting the standard. And so it really gives students something actionable to do. So there's like this combination of what we used to do blended with this new approach on how to put all this information into a grade book to communicate to students and families. And I also absolutely love the minimum grading concept. I don't know why that was so eye-opening and why it has taken me over 20 years to have that aha moment. This book made me, have a lot of those aha moments, but just that mathematical piece of the 100 points is just, why are we putting 60% of value on an F out of 100 points? It doesn't even make sense. So just that we're having these questions and these discussions.
I wonder
really
about
powerful.
that. So, one of my questions about the minimum grading thing is when one of my students sees a 0 in the grade book, they go, oh, I'm missing that assignment. I need to do it. And they usually do it. It often actually does motivate them to do it. I can see why a 0 is unmotivating for a kid who can't do anything about it. Like if it's a 0 and you can't change it, I get it. That's gotta suck. But if it's a 0 because you haven't turned it in yet, and I'm still kind of nagging you to turn it in, my students will often respond to that. If I put in a 50, they go, that's good enough. And they stop. They never do that missing work. So I don't have that piece of evidence that I need for their standards-based grade. So like,
and that's
I'm
why,
really
Jen,
wrestling with that one. Really wrestling
that's
with
why the grade book on page 198
I know, I
that
love that page.
example, right? That lets the student know you're getting a 0 on this assignment. It's missing. I cannot, you have given me no information on
Right.
your progress. And I need that information in order to make a judgment about where you are according to the standards.
Right. And I did that a lot last quarter. It helped. I could mark things as unknown instead of as a 0 in Canvas.
If you're able to manipulate the codes in your grade book, then that's really helpful, because I know at the high school level, a lot of times that grade book is the primary source of communication between parents and teachers, between students and teachers, between students and their parents. And that's where this really hits me, this quote really hits me as being complicit in the system as a caregiver, right? I've been doing standards-based grading work for years in my classroom. And to this day, when my now going into freshman son asks me if he can do something, what's the first question I ask him?
How are your grades?
Right? How are your grades? So I'm propping up this system at home and reiterating these values to him, while at the same time trying to dismantle it for my students and in that format. And so that's been something that actually my husband and I have been struggling with a lot at home. But that being able to hack the grade book so that, you know, you have all of the assignments listed, so that then if a student does perform poorly on a summative assessment, then you go back and you look and you're like, oh, you didn't do these practice exercises, right? If you don't engage in the practice, how do you expect to be able to have refined your craft by the time that you're ready to show me what you know and can do?
In Canvas, I can change it so it shows in words. It can say beginning, I forgot what my words were. Beginning, excels, proficient, or unknown, or basic, but it still puts a number next to it. So if I mark it as unknown, it still puts a 0 next to it. I'm like, stop putting numbers there. I just want words.
What I've done, Jen, is because we use Canvas also in our district, and so I exclusively use the 0 to 4 scale only. I never do anything aside from that in my grade book. But I have found that it's not as problematic if you have a 0 in there, if that 0 is not being counted towards a percentage for the grade, right? So if that 0 is being used as a communication tool that I don't have any evidence for you of this assignment, it is not counting against you, because I can't count something against you if I don't know how you did at it, at a particular assignment. However, this is a communication tool. I think that is less problematic than if it's a 0 and it's on a 100-point scale, right? And 50 is automatically extra painful for those students. In wanting to be the angel's advocate, I also wanted to circle around to your comment in the chat, Jen. You said, I find one challenge of standards-based grading is it takes so long to have a grade because the summative comes so late in the process. And so again, wanting to be that angel's advocate, I think that what's really powerful here is this is an opportunity for us to engage in powerful vertical articulation with our colleagues, right? This is our chance to sit down with those standards and to find out what we're going to focus on at what point in time, and how that's, I mean, we share standards in 11th and 12th grade, for example, right? So what is that going to look like? Where is our focus going to be in any one given term of study that we are working? That doesn't mean students won't continue to grow in those standards throughout, but how are we going to really assess those specific standards, those substandards? How are we going to make sure that we're giving students the best opportunity to prove their mastery in those different categories? And then I think that when we're doing that, and when we're providing students with project-based learning opportunities along the way, where they have multiple opportunities to demonstrate how well they can be successful using these particular skills, or how well they can demonstrate the knowledge for that particular item, then it puts less pressure on a summative assessment, right? It allows the formative process to really be where we are determining this, what supports are needed for students in order to help them to grow. And that's a shift that I think was really powerful for me in my practice, was this idea of not relying on a summative assessment in order to assign a grade.
I think it might be important to note, I think a lot of us right here in this room are ELA focused. And so we are having this conversation around this ELA lens. And it's true, in the ELA world, we do wait a long time for those summative assessments because there's so many standards to master in order to show proficiency, like on informational writing, for example. So yeah, we have these struggles that we have. And I think our math colleagues, they do assessments more often, right, within units. And so they get a better taste. So I just think it's important to have that conversation that we're all ELA teachers. I know Jennifer Roberts is, I know Cassiopeia is, I know I am, and Jennifer Madeiros, yeah.
But then again, looking at it through the special ed lens, especially at the high school level, this idea of, like Cassiopeia said, angel's advocate, you taking the time, but that's really offering multiple opportunities for students to master the content, or to dig into the various resources and tools to help them better understand or arrive at their landing spot, versus they're hit with a summative assessment, or they're hit with an assessment and there's this sense of being overwhelmed. You really, a lot of the times it's students that have IEPs, having the time and having things broken out for them over a period of time, and just giving that time for them to access various tools tends to be a lot more beneficial than, you got to know this and I'm going to let me see where you are as far as an assessment.
And we can't wait, because if we wait till the end of the grading period to give the summative assessment, we are not giving the students the opportunity to reflect on their progress of where they are and to fix that assessment and to reassess. So we really do have to be doing some of these micro assessments along the way. And as ELA teachers, we kind of have to think magically about that. How do we make that happen?
Absolutely.
It's as much about the parents as anything. I'm finding myself retraining my students' parents and my students that you're not going to see a new grade in the grade book every 2 days. You know, it's not going to happen that fast. Or you're going to see a grade that is a C because I can look at the performance scale and I see you have the basic skills. And in a couple, days, we're going to get to the performance assessment where you're going to get a chance to show me that you are proficient at that skill, and your grade will go up. But like, I've never had a C before. I'm like, it's okay. You have a C now. We've been doing basic skills. We're about to get to the proficient skills, and you're going to get a chance to do better on that. You planned your essay. Planning an essay is a basic skill. You have that. Good. Now we're going to write the essay and you can show you're proficient. So that's just kind of explaining to everyone what's going on and how things are a little different, and that's not a bad thing, and holding all their hands, that's the fun part.
Exactly. Well, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take us to the next slide really quickly. So next up, we're going to be, we would typically engage in this activity where we're brainstorming some questions that relate to the text. We were going to do this in breakout rooms, but looking at our time and really wanting to make sure that we're respecting your time, I have added this link to the chat as well as to the Padlet. So you will have access to it after this session, and we will leave it live so you can continue to add to it on an ongoing basis and refer back to it as a reference. So if you have not used Jamboard before, it's a virtual whiteboard that allows you to work collaboratively with a group of people. And it's really great for a classroom because it's part of Google Suite. It's easy to share, change permissions, and engage with. So you're going to notice on the Jamboard that there is a bar on the left-hand side of the screen, which has buttons on it. Each one does something different. You can use the text feature, the sticky notes, you can add a picture, and you're going to see these questions right here on the screen. So on that Jamboard, again, the questions are, what were the inequitable grading practices that most disarmed or surprised you as you read about them? What are some challenges you anticipate as you start to integrate more equitable practices in your classroom or on your campus? Where do you plan to start as you begin making these changes, and what supports might you need to implement these changes? And we think that these are really important questions because they really allow us to be a little bit more aware of what needs exist so that we can hopefully all work together to create systemic change. And rather than spending the time on this together, I would love to actually hop to our next slide in just a moment, which will allow us to just engage in any final open discussion in order to wrap up this conversation, just because I know that we all have our burning questions and things that we hoped we would take away from this. I hope that this will allow us to kind of get those questions out, and then we can do follow-up conversations through social media or even a follow-up meeting if that's something that you would like to do to talk about those questions on the Jamboard. Joanne?
Yeah, so really this is open discussion. If there's anything pressing, you were like, when reading the book, I really wanted to talk this out with someone, or if you want to just talk a little bit deeper about something we've already discussed, or share maybe one thing you want to implement and take away and start as this new school year heads into, as we head into this new school year. So it is open. And Belle, if you want to add your ideas and thoughts to the chat, or if anyone wants to add ideas and thoughts to the chat, please do that as well.
I'm seeing a comment in the Jamboard again around cheating. So I don't know if that's something, if people have tackled that or built a little bit of capacity. Yes, Jennifer.
I did. I had a kid plagiarize really badly near the end of the year. And I turned to our academic honesty policy and it said I was supposed to give him a 0. And I went, well, I can't give him a 0. I don't have zeros. I have the fact that he hasn't shown me proficiency at this skill. So all I could do, and what worked, is I could have a restorative conversation with the child. The parent was off her rocker. She told him to go copy sentences from other authors and change them, because how else was he going to learn to write better? And I'm like, oh God, so she was going nuts. I'm like, you're just going to need to go talk to the vice principal about that. But I had a great conversation with the kid where I talked about, this doesn't show me that you can write this essay. Maybe you'd like to switch to the assignment where you only have to write the paragraph, because that could still show me that you're proficient. It just won't show me that you excel at this analysis skill. And he said, yeah, I think the paragraph is more my speed. So he wrote the paragraph, and you know what? He was proficient at the skill. He didn't get out of doing the work. He got to do an assignment that was more appropriate for him. He felt good about it. I felt good about it. He didn't do a great job on it. I mean, it was okay. But my feedback to him was, I really wish you had chosen this option to begin with, because if we hadn't been through a week of, yes, you plagiarized, no, I didn't. If we hadn't gone through all that back and forth with his mom, he would have had more time to revise and redo it. So he understood that, and that went really well. And I didn't have to give him a 0. I didn't have to follow a policy that was going to turn his grade from a C to a D. And I really liked that. And now I'm nagging my principal about how do we revise our academic honesty policy so it's more in line with the whole standards-based grading thing. So I will tell that story to anybody, because it really worked.
Well, you just did. This was recorded.
There you go. We're recording.
Share your story. Thank you. And I wanted to add on that, one of the my big takeaways from Grading for Equity was that third section, right, on motivation. And I think that is something that I didn't realize going into this. I think we as teachers have preconceived notions of how we think students are going to respond to specific situations. But in actuality, using processes that are more inequitable, or that are more equitable for students, and getting rid of these processes that are more inequitable allows students to bring more of their authentic self, and it allows them to engage in a space where they feel safe to engage, where they feel that their contributions are valued. And so I absolutely feel like cheating is a much bigger problem in a classroom that uses more traditional grading practices, where students feel like they have to cheat in order to make the bare minimum, right? And it's less of a problem where we're asking students to engage in authentic interactions with us that are surrounding their specific goals. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
And this child learned more than how to analyze and write a paragraph. This child learned, if I have conversations with the adult in my life, I might have a powerful learning opportunity, and had this person come to you sooner with the struggles they were having, he would have avoided this situation entirely. So he's going to walk into next year knowing, hey, I can maybe have some conversations with my teachers,
Mhm.
and those conversations will lead me to a different kind of success. So
Sure.
that's a
And I
lifelong skill.
totally left him with, and if you're still feeling unconfident about your writing next year, please come to me and we can talk through prompts and talk about how you want to structure things, and I will still help you. And he's like, really? I'm like, yes.
And he'll come back to you.
If anybody wants it, I just dropped a link to our academic honesty unit.
Nice.
My team we modeled it on an ERWC unit for ninth graders, but we didn't like the stereotypes unit. It wasn't working for our kids well. So we switched it to an academic honesty unit, and I wrote up a description of how that unit goes and what works with it and stuff. And it needs some revision to account for standards-based grading at this point, but it's got all the parts and pieces.
Thank you, Jennifer. Do you mind if I add that to our follow-up resources document that we're going to share at the end of the session?
Sure. Like
And
I said,
Jen
it's
has
a work in
another-
progress, but- What?
Jen has another really valuable resource for people who are concerned about having students resubmit work and how that could feel like a huge mountain of work. Jen has a great process where she uses Google Forms, and students have become very familiar with how to utilize her process. So maybe Jen, can you share the link to your blog
Yeah.
on that?
This is the request to regrade form. All the
Great.
requests go to us. I teach ELA, so it's usually not a test that they need to retake. It's revising an essay. So Google Classroom kind of solves some of this. This is sort of, I guess, Canvas solved it for me really well because they would just resubmit on Canvas and I would see it. But before Canvas, Google Classroom does a terrible job telling you if someone has resubmitted something. And so I would have my students request a regrade. It's a reflection form. And then it kept everything in a spreadsheet for me, and my co-teacher and I could both work on it, and we both knew what was going on. And I didn't lose the email requests or the note on my desk or the something like that. So it just kept me organized.
I love that. And one of the other fun tips that I have for retakes and regrades would be to use different ed tech tools, right? So if you go in and you can use things like Flipgrid, for example, to have students actually walk through what they've done, what their changes are, and then they can actually submit it to you as well. And it allows you to have a conversation with the student that's asynchronous if you're not able to be available at the same time that they are. So there are a lot of really great tools out there that you can leverage for unusual methods of assessment.
And that's a great segue. Dr. Medeiros, and I won't read it. She put something in the chat, and I'm thinking this.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the student, if we're student focused and student centered, one of the things I put as a starting point, how do I go about this change, is have a conversation with students. What does fairness look like? What is equitable grading? What resources do you need? What are you comfortable with? What just abundance of questions to get a better idea so that they have voice and choice through this process. You are on your way to more equitable grading practices, or just to get you to start, a starting point.
Exactly. Well, I know we're a bit over time, so let's hop to our facilitation debrief. And just so that you all know, this debrief here is really intended just to give you a very high level idea of what types of activities we did in our facilitation of this conversation today. So if you do have any questions about any of these practices, or if you have any of the questions about any of the content, you are welcome to reach out to us through social media. We do have our information on this slide here, and this will also be available to you later on. So if you would like to reach out to any of us and you want to give this a quick screenshot, you can jot down our contact information, and we are really, really excited to engage with you. We're using hashtag BSF Book Club. So please, 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 let's continue this conversation. We want to make sure that we are not losing the important motion that we're making forward towards more equitable for our students. And we also want to thank everyone today for being here. As you can see, Here, we do have a bunch of resources where you can get more information. You can visit our bookshop by visiting BIPOCsupportfoundation.org and clicking on the bookshop link. That is where we are curating lists of fiction, nonfiction, and pedagogy books for pre-readers, tweens, teens, adults, everyone in between. And our bookshop is for everyone, those who are in the field of education and those in the community at large. A portion of all of the purchases there go to support BIPOC Support Foundation and the work that we're doing. Also on the website, you can subscribe to our newsletter, donate to the nonprofit to help with this work, and access all of our offerings under the resource tab. And we do have a survey today we would love to have you fill out if you are willing to do so. I have added it to the chat. It didn't link it, but hopefully we can get an updated link in the chat. This will help give us some feedback about the event, but we will also use it as a way to contact you specifically with a list of follow-up resources, podcasts, texts, and elements that may help you in starting your Grading for Equity journey. We'll also include you in our messaging for the next book club. The next one is going back to our first quarter type of style, and we will be actually speaking on texts that align with the Asian American Pacific Islander experience. So thank you again so much for being here today. We really, really appreciate you being here and being part of this important work. We're looking forward to our continued work together. And if you would like to stick around to chat, I will be more than happy to stay. My colleagues can stay as well. If you're catching up on this on YouTube later on, thank you so much for watching and have a great day.